Thank you so much. Thank you for the organization of this fascinating conference. I'd like to take you west of the Mississippi today, actually to Indian Territory. That place that roughly corresponds today to to Oklahoma, to study post-removal strategies of resistance and survivance by Native Americans that were deported there, as yet another paradigm of colonization, and in the meantime, another paradigm of racialization, as we'll see. So, the emergence of the concept of settler colonialism to apprehend the imperial expansionism of the United States in the territories of the West in the 19th century did not go without debates. Its integration to the field of indigenous studies has allowed to focus on Native American experiences while facing the colonial power's intention to otherize, dispossess, remove, and eliminate indigenous populations in the wake of the continued colonial invasion of North America. But recent tendency in historiography has also been to take the systematically destructive essence of settler colonialism for granted, and consequently to affirm the inherent victimhood of Native Americans. This is now challenged somehow by scholars of new histories who precisely highlight the indigenous agency. As indigenous studies have shown, there were occurrences when Euro-American colonists did not get the upper hand, and contested places where colonial appropriation and settlement was far from certain. The native ground that emerged west of the Mississippi between the indigenous populations of the Great Plains and the southeastern indigenous populations who underwent deportation by the federal government in the 1830s is one of them. There, victims of settler colonialism were also agents in the cultural construction of a multi-ethnic space that was not only contested but also far from being technically appropriated by the United States colonial state. The diasporic movements of the indigenous populations originating from regions in the southeast of the United States, namely the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw, to Western territories illustrate the need for the historiographical reassessment of settler colonialism as a linear process. The position these indigenous populations came to occupy challenges the binary approach imposed by settler colonial studies. These indigenous communities in exile also became invaders of the indigenous West, and the strategies they developed in these appropriated spaces to secure and adapt to their new environments put them in a position of settlers at the same time, exiles and pioneers. This presentation aims at studying the appropriation by the deported southeastern indigenous populations of the Indian Territory, that place that was artificially carved out of the Louisiana Purchase Territory to relocate the indigenous populations of the East and the West of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the strategies of survivance they developed there as one ambivalent paradigm of colonial expansion and of racialization. As they underwent deportation beyond the limits of the politically organized territories of the Union to the outskirts of the American Republic and the regions of the Great Plains, where notably the Comanche Empire had long developed, the Cherokee, through forced dispossession and forced exile, the complete annihilation of their social and cultural environment, faced complete uprooting. The loss of land implied the end of indigenous sovereignty in the East, along with the Supreme Court decision to make indigenous nations dependent and domestic in 1831. In addition, uprooting questioned the cultural cohesion of the relocated populations. They were not only confronted to the massive death rates, but also to the need to provide the deported people with a new form of unity away from the land of their ancestors east of the Mississippi. Yet, one may contend that forced removal to Indian Territory could also be analyzed as a challenge to which relocated populations rose. The resilience of the southeastern indigenous populations was indeed characterized by the ability of the leaders to maintain the unity of the nation despite internal strife, and to affirm the legitimacy to appropriate the lands allocated by the federal government at the very expense of the indigenous communities of the plains. Despite forced removal, they transposed in the West the calculated strategy they had developed in the East to resist colonial invasion, which consisted in adhering adhering to the American standards of civilization to convince the United States government to let them stay on their ancestral lands. Such strategic mimesis imply not only the exploitation of the technology inherited from Euro-American settler colonialism, including, for instance, the shaping of indigenous nations, a policy that allowed them to oppose the early American Republic using a Euro-American legal language, but also its ideological discourse, which rhetorically positioned the southeastern indigenous nations on the civilized side of the colonial venture. I would argue that the place the deported populations were forced to take in the Great Plains made them agents of the construction of what Stephen H. Long described at the time as the Great American Desert, and somehow, by proxy, of imperial American expansion. In order to develop what may seem to be quite a provocative argument here, the implementation of strategic mimesis east of the Mississippi shall be studied first, to better apprehend the cultural specificity of the southeastern indigenous diaspora. This will help us analyze why the removal process, characterized by the pursuance of such a strategy of resistance through cultural adaptation, seems to have pushed the border between civilization and the wilderness farther west, as the deported populations came to hold a position of civilized colonizers of uncivilized plains natives. Then, the agency deported nations were able to develop shall be identified, particularly in the context of diplomacy towards the indigenous population of the plains on an artificially created frontier line, despite their imposed dependence on the federal government. Such a frame will allow us to study the journal of Elijah Hicks, a prominent Cherokee emissary sent beyond the western border to negotiate peace with the Comanche under the aegis of the federal government. This primary source, which was first published in 1930 and has not been restudied ever since, will help us delve into the complexity of indigenous diplomacy in the region and the subsequent racializing process in the West. Among the more than 100,000 Eastern indigenous individuals who had been forcibly removed west of the Mississippi by the end of the 1830s, the populations qualified as civilized tribes by the British colonists and the American authorities since the end of the 18th century, namely the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creeks, were characterized by a certain adjustment to Euro-American culture. Despite their anthropological differences, they shared a common adaptation to the colonial presence on their lands. The sedentary nature of these communities of agriculturists favored trade relations with the colonists and the long-term implantation of trading posts. The increasing scarcity of game in the Southeast due to the ever-growing demand in fur by the colonists pushed indigenous communities to develop extensive agriculture and participate actively in the market economy that developed in the region to adapt the colonial invasion and maintain their autonomy. Also, the important phenomenon of intermarriages between many Scottish traders and native women led to the appearance of a biracial economic property elite that developed plantation slavery, participated in the development of a capitalistic mode of agriculture, and took over control, sometimes by coercive means, of the tribal political life. The centralization of indigenous power through the creation of national councils at the expense of the traditional clan system allowed the new generation of indigenous leaders to implement a strategy of resistance through transculturation that aimed at instilling elements of Euro-American civilization. Seizing the civilizing intent of the early American Republic as an opportunity to wait in the technological and ideological process of Euro-American settlement and delay the moment when they would be annihilated by colonial submersion, they strategically integrated the long-established colonial discourse of progress toward civilization. They welcomed the allegedly benevolent Jeffersonian civilization program that aimed at accelerating what was seen as the normal progress of human communities from savagism to civilization, and at making Native American farmers of the agrarian republic who would be willing to relinquish their hunting grounds, assimilate to American society, in other words, to disappear. They portrayed their people as civilized Indians who could help advance U.S. objectives as long as they were treated as a civilized, separate nation. The Cherokee, by the end of the 1810s, had adopted a written tradition, self-defined as a nation, and resisted their planned annihilation legally in the East as a nation-state with a written constitution drafted in 1827. Furthermore, Cherokee citizenship that defined national collective belonging through race systematically excluded African Americans to highlight indigenous compatibility with the colonial sphere within the frame of civilization and progress. Still, that's the Constitution of the Cherokee Nation in 1827, that is both in English and Cherokee language. Still, President Andrew Jackson relied on the pseudoscientific racist argument of indigenous degradation to fulfill the role it was elected for in 1828, that of a democratic representative of the vast Southern Empire, accompanying the momentum of nationalist popular expansion that characterized the 1820s. He strategically denied that those he referred to as a few savage hunters in his address to Congress in December 1830 had, as the Cherokee leaders themselves affirmed in 1829, quote, unexpectedly become civilized. Although Indian removal remains the cornerstone of Jackson's presidency, characterized by the authoritarian passing of the Indian Removal Act, the project of relocating Native Americans beyond the Mississippi was not new. In the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson had already considered these western territories for the relocation of indigenous populations as an alternative to assimilation, should the latter fail to become civilized. But the American Society for Promoting the Civilization and General Improvement of the Indian Tribes within the United States, created in 1822, played a major role in convincing federal authorities, intellectuals, and missionaries alike that the immigration of Native Americans constituted the most viable and humane solution to racial incompatibility within the American Republic. Grasping the allegedly philanthropic argument that removal was a way to save Native Americans from inevitable disappearance, and simultaneously offering short-term solutions to Southern settlers and planters who had elected him in 1828, Jackson, through large-scale deportation of thousands of natives, transformed the plans of the advocates for the creation of an Indian colony in the West into a reality. Indian removal was more than mere relegation. The thinkers of indigenous colonization had from the start envisioned Indian territory in the West as a pioneer settlement, where relocated natives would continue to improve toward civilization and bring the benefits of such progress to the uncivilized indigenous populations of the region. Isaac McCoy, missionary among the indigenous populations of Indiana, was one of the most prominent advocates of colonization. He contended that with the support of federal authorities, through the continued presence of U.S. agents and missionaries sent among the relocated natives, quote, the colony would commence and improve much after the manner of all new settlements of the whites, unquote. Not only did McCoy imply that relocated indigenous nations would improve, an argument also mentioned by Jackson in Congress when he insisted that Indians in the West would, quote, pursue happiness their own way until they could become, quote again, an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. But he went farther in explaining that immigrants to the territory would be prepared for citizenship in the future. Ideologically, the colonization project underlying Indian removal not only positioned Indian territory under the authority of the American government, it also led to a form of cultural extension of the American Republic in territories that were not conquered yet by the United States. While the imposed dependence on the federal state was the very limit, but also the guarantee of their legitimacy on allocated lands, the in-between position they came to occupy was the only place to be found for resilience. Indian territory was also considered by the federal government as a buffer zone in a still geopolitically volatile West, operated by local indigenous populations, but also the Republic of Mexico ever since 1821, and the recently independent Republic of Texas in 1836. Within the limited latitude, the southeastern populations turned their ancestral peoples into political nations and found means to develop the influence on the American state in somehow defining the terms of the construction of the frontier. Roughly half of the allocated lands in the West corresponded to the important hunting grounds of the Comanche, Kiowa, Catoctin, Wichita, and Osage. The civilization of relocated natives was used by the federal authorities as an argument to legitimize the appropriation of allocated lands. The deported nations transposed the state-making apparatus developed in the East and reinforced it in each nation with the drafting of national constitutions. This not only reaffirmed the legal legitimacy to occupy territories, but also intensified the process of acculturation. Also, as they appropriated the lands that were granted to legitimize their sovereignty despite their dependence on federal authorities, and as they secured their geographical integrity facing the resistance of the invaded indigenous populations of the plains, they participated in the creation of one of those multiple frontier societies that emerged in a context of Western expansion, shaped by the sometimes antagonistic agencies of groups that were forced to interact. While navigating through the interstices of the American colonial project in these regions where indigenous domination still prevailed, the southeastern natives got involved on a native ground where they had to adapt to native protocol, dispense gifts, accommodate native diplomatic and military demands, and conform to native expectations. The creation of Indian Territory imposed a confrontation between culturally different native populations. Indigenous communities of the plains were nomadic or semi-nomadic, who relied mostly on hunting, fruit picking, and limited agriculture, while the descendants of the Mississippian civilization of the Southeast were sedentary agriculturists. But most importantly, the long-term process of strategic mimesis among the deported nation had made them, at least for the leading elite, southern-like capitalist planters. The geographical line that separated the two populations was doubled by a cultural separation line characterized by the prejudice southeastern natives had developed towards natives of the plains in the pursuit of civilization. A rhetorical differentiation was made by the southeastern natives between them and the indigenous populations of the plain, with whom they associated racial stereotypes invented by European settlers to justify conquest. As they resisted the policy of removal in the East, southeastern indigenous leaders had questioned the argument that removal would make them more civilized and had depicted the West as, quote, an absence of civilization, a region that was, quote again, only fit for savages. The native ground that emerged between the relocated nations west of the Indian Territory was therefore characterized by cultural discrepancy. In his journal, Ethan Allen Hitchcock, a federal agent sent to Indian Territory to supervise the settlement of deported populations, described a peculiar scene that occurred on December 8, 1841, when a group of Osage came to visit the Cherokee in traditional attire. Quote, "Some half a dozen Osage Indians made their appearance last evening at the council ground. Their heads were shaved and ornamented with feathers, and they wore blankets in primitive style. The Cherokees gathered around them and gazed at them with as much curiosity as if they had never seen an Indian. The Osages would hardly have attracted more curiosity in the city of New York." Unquote. All right. To secure their fragile settlement in the first groups of natives who had migrated to the West called for support of the federal government, which, in line with the terms of the imposed removal treaties, guaranteed the protection notably against foreign enemies. In the process, the relocated nations participated in the consolidation of the frontier in a way that was also benefiting the United States. It was materialized by the building of military forts on the western borderline of Indian Territory, which proved to be a major asset in the American expansion process, while it protected the imposed living space of native migrants. With the support of the government, the Southeastern nations also engaged in diplomatic relations with the indigenous populations of the plains. In 1832, then Secretary of War Lewis Cass founded the Stokes Commission, aimed at negotiating peace with relocated nations and the Comanche. In 1834, an expedition was sent to the westernmost part of Indian Territory and beyond in the plains, led by Colonel Henry Dodge, accompanied by George Catlin, but also by Cherokee guides. After a month of negotiation with the Comanche, a treaty was eventually signed at Camp Holmes on July 10, 1835. Although the leaders of the plains may not have totally understood that the treaty actually implied that they had to relinquish their hunting grounds, the active part taken by relocated natives in the first stage of negotiations illustrate the agency they developed in the securing of their own environment. As they progressively superseded the diplomatic initiatives of the United States government to affirm their costly gained sovereignty in the West, they became peacemakers of the frontier. They had to navigate through Western intercultural spaces they did not dominate, in search of congruence with the communities that were imposing their presence upon. They used their belonging to the civilized colonial sphere to anchor their right to self-determination in the very land that they colonized. In the fall of 1845, as the Mexican-American War loomed, the federal government sent yet another expedition in the plains to put an end to the violence committed on the settlers of the state of Texas that had just joined the Union. Important figures of the Southeastern nations joined the expedition, among whom Elijah Hicks, a prominent member of the Cherokee national government. The journal of Elijah Hicks wrote during his expedition allows one to get more insight on the nature of the diplomatic and cultural interactions at work. First, as the expedition made headway in the plains, still dominated by the local indigenous populations, the emissaries were looking for to have them sign treaties of peace and diplomatic collaboration. One notices that it was difficult for them to actually encounter those populations in this vast territory where they were in a technical minority. When encounters actually occurred, these are indeed native grounds, contested places characterized by cultural differences, on which civilized diplomats, ideologically strong but in a position of political minority, had to adapt to native protocol and submit to the will of the chief of the plains. On March 5, 1845, for instance, Elijah Hicks describes his encounter with Comanche chief Buffalo Hump. Quote, "A party of chiefs, squaws and women and children appeared and seated themselves in half moon. Young men fantastically dressed, painted with full heads of hair, well dressed in Comanche dress and trinketed and appeared well, though somewhat effeminate." End quote. Hicks here adapts to Comanche protocol. The pipe of peace was lighted by the chief and justifies his presence to the Comanche chief with the diplomatic humility required. Quote again, "The Cherokee chief appointed us, and we have come and taken you by the hand. Our hearts are rejoiced to get acquainted with our brothers, the Comanches. We are natives, and so are you, and we consider you as brothers. The end of the Cherokees and Comanche are white. We have never done each other any wrong." A few days later, yet another meeting occurred, this time with Comanche chief Bourhis. We notice Hicks' need for intercultural adaptation in his words. Quote again, "Bourhis called this morning and introduced himself, and I did the same in Comanche court style by hugging one arm over the shoulder and the other below the armpit, and then to the other shoulder and pit." End quote. Still, what is to be noticed in the speeches Hicks delivers to Buffalo Hump, Bourhis, and other chiefs is the intention to assert Cherokee interests and, at the same time, those of the United States. And most importantly, the civilizing attitude in this diplomatic endeavor. The entry of March 11 reads, quote, "Hicks next addressed the meeting and said that he was truly glad to see his brother and smoke the pipe of peace. This was the way to keep and preserve friendship. The president had sent him to give them this talk, and it was a good talk. The word of the president was true and was always good. The Cherokees knew that it was so. The Cherokees had carried war against the whites a great while ago. The president told them to stop, and they did so. He told them to learn to farm and raise stock, and they done so. And they had done well ever since, end quote. The reaction of the Comanche chief Pahuka during one of those meetings is particularly eloquent. He said, quote, Pahuka answered these several speeches by stating that he came a long way to see his white brothers, the Cherokees and Creeks, and he assured them that he was pleased to hear all the talks, and he must say they were good, end quote. Because it is Elijah Hicks' journal, it is difficult to actually determine whether the Comanche chief really considered him and his fellow Cherokee emissaries as white, or whether there is simply a missing comma in the transcription. Yet, one thing is certain. From the Comanche perspective, the Euro-American, Cherokee, and Creek diplomats all belong to the same cultural sphere, beyond the geographical and cultural line that separated indigenous country and occupied territory. Undeniably, this concluding quote allows for a change of perspective regarding the multifaceted post-removal position of the southeastern nations. The strategies they developed to affirm their fragile sovereignty in this new environment that included active participation in treaty-making processes targeting the natives of the plains resembled the colonial attitude towards indigenous populations and seemed to coincide with the momentum of imperial expansionism indigenous people had to face as a whole. In a 2019 article, historian T.U. Miles addressed the semantic difficulty of properly identifying the thousands of African Americans who, trying to escape oppression, quote, moved north or west onto violated indigenous lands in the 19th century, unquote. Dissatisfied with terms such as black settlers or black pioneers, she suggested new notions be defined, which would reflect more accurately the experience of those victims of American colonial state who still came to dwell in a house of settler colonialism. Indeed, the deportation of the southeastern nations in the mid-19th century enabled the federal government to move the frontier farther west in territories it had not settled yet. Also, at a time when the belief in manifest destiny developed, survivants west of the Mississippi interestingly made relocated natives pioneers and settlers, allowing for territorial construction beyond the line of civilization defined by American colonial states. Yet, the semantic apprehension of the full scope of the Native American experience in such an ambivalent context still needs to be addressed. Thank you.